Mrs. Johnson had been teaching at Oakwood Elementary for over 2 decades. She was well respected by her students and colleagues alike, known for her patience and dedication to helping each child reach their full potential. But as the school year drew to a close, Mrs. Johnson began to notice something strange about one of her students, in particular Emily Wilson. The bright-eyed 6-year-old had always been diligent in class, but lately, she seemed different. Her eyes would glaze over during lessons, and when asked questions, she'd stare blankly into space. One day, as the final lesson of the year approached, Mrs. Johnson realized that something was terribly wrong with Emily. She couldn't shake off the feeling that her student had been watching her all along, studying her every move. The classroom seemed to grow darker and more oppressive as they sat down for their last class together. As the clock struck 5, Mrs. Johnson handed out a final worksheet on fractions. But when she turned back to face Emily, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The child's eyes had changed, transformed into 2 empty black holes that seemed to suck all light and hope from the room. And in that moment, Mrs. Johnson knew that some lessons were better left unlearned. The final lesson was not one of math or science, but a terrible truth about the darkness that lurked within every human heart. Emily's eyes locked onto hers, and with an unsettling calmness, she whispered, "I've been learning all year." Mrs. Jenkins stood at the front of her classroom, surveying the sea of expectant faces before her. It was the last day of school for this group of students, and she had planned a special final lesson to commemorate their graduation. As they settled in, Mrs. Jenkins began to speak, her voice low and soothing. "Today is not just any ordinary day," she said. "It's your last chance to learn something truly important." She paused, letting the words hang in the air like a challenge. The students exchanged nervous glances, sensing that there was more to this lesson than met the eye. Mrs. Jenkins walked over to her desk and began to write on a piece of paper with a flourish. "I want you all to take out your journals," she instructed, handing each student their own blank page. As they complied, Mrs. Jenkins wrote something in bold letters across the top: "The truth is not for the weak." The students looked at each other uncertainly, but Mrs. Jenkins just smiled and nodded. As the minutes ticked by, a strange feeling began to creep over the class. It started with small things: papers rustling, chairs creaking, whispers in the background. But as time went on, it grew louder and more intense. The students' eyes took on an unsettling glaze, their faces frozen in terror. And then, Mrs. Jenkins spoke again: "The truth is not for those who can't handle it." As she finished speaking, her body began to stretch and contort, like a puppet being manipulated by unseen strings. Her face elongated into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. The students screamed as their teacher's eyes turned black as coal, filling the room with an inky darkness that seemed to have a life of its own. Mrs. Jenkins stood at the front of her classroom, surveying the sea of expectant faces before her. It was the last day of school for this group of students, and she had one final lesson to impart. "Today," she began, "we're going to talk about something very important: the power of memories." She wrote a single word on the blackboard: "Remember." The class scribbled it down in their notebooks. Mrs. Jenkins' eyes seemed to gleam with an unsettling intensity as she continued. "You see, every memory we make is like a seed that takes root and grows into something new. But what happens when those seeds are planted too deeply? When they begin to consume us?" As the students exchanged nervous glances, Mrs. Jenkins began to pace around the room, her voice growing more urgent with each step. "You think you can just erase memories, don't you? Just push them away like unwanted thoughts? But it's not that simple." She stopped in front of a student who had been quietly observing from his seat at the back of the class. His eyes were wide and frightened as Mrs. Jenkins fixed him with an unblinking stare. "You see," she whispered, her breath cold against his ear, "memories are like tiny monsters living inside us all the time. And once they're planted, there's no going back." The student shuddered, but it was too late. As he looked around at his classmates, Mrs. Jenkins' eyes seemed to bore into their very souls, and one by one, she began to whisper those same haunting words, "Remember! Remember!" Until the entire class was lost in a sea of terror, trapped forever with the darkest memories they had ever made. And when the school opened again on Monday morning, Mrs. Jenkins' classroom was empty, but her legacy lived on, etched into the minds and hearts of those who still remembered that terrible final lesson.